The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. George Orwell. Before you learned to walk, before you spoke your first word, before you even understood what obedience meant, you were already being trained to comply. This wasn't done with chains or threats. It was done with something far more insidious: love itself. Think about it. Your first lesson in existence wasn't about freedom or self-discovery. It was about reading faces, interpreting moods, and adjusting your behavior to maintain approval. When you cried and your caregiver's face showed frustration, you learned to modulate your needs. When you reached for something and received a sharp no, you learned that your desires were secondary to someone else's comfort. You weren't born to obey. You were born wild, authentic, demanding what you needed when you needed it. But within months, that authentic self was being systematically dismantled and replaced with something more manageable: a people pleaser, a being whose primary drive wasn't self-actualization, but social harmony. Consider this deeply disturbing reality. By the time you were 18 months old, you had already internalized a complex set of rules about when your emotions were acceptable and when they weren't. You learned that joy was welcome only if it didn't disturb others, that sadness was tolerable only if it didn't last too long, and that anger was dangerous, something that could cost you the love you desperately needed to survive. This early, emotional training created what psychologists call emotional labor, the exhausting work of managing not just your own feelings, but everyone else's comfort with your feelings. You became a tiny diplomat, a miniature emotional manager, responsible for maintaining peace in relationships where you had no actual power. The tragedy isn't that this happened to you. The tragedy is that you've spent your entire life believing this programming represents who you really are. You've mistaken your survival adaptations for your authentic personality. You've confused your trauma responses with your natural temperament. Here's the uncomfortable truth they never told you. Every single behavior pattern you think of as mature, responsible, or adult is actually a sophisticated survival mechanism you developed before you could even form memories. Your politeness, your people-pleasing, your chronic need for approval. These aren't virtues. They're symptoms of a nervous system that learned before you could walk that your survival depended on making others comfortable with your existence. Watch how you move through the world now. Notice how you automatically scan every room for the emotional temperature. See how you instinctively adjust your energy to match what you perceive others need from you. Observe how you've become so skilled at reading micro-expressions that you can detect disapproval before it's even consciously formed in someone else's mind. This isn't emotional intelligence. This is hypervigilance masquerading as empathy. This is the survival skill of a being who learned before language that their very existence was conditional on their ability to make others comfortable. And the most insidious part? The very people who programmed you convinced you that this programming was love. Michel Foucault spent his life studying power, not the obvious kind that comes with uniforms and weapons, but the subtle kind that shapes souls. He understood something that most people never grasp. The most effective control systems are the ones you can't see, the ones that make you complicit in your own domination. Your family wasn't trying to destroy you. They were simply passing down the same invisible control systems that had been passed down to them. Generation after generation, each family becomes a training ground for producing compliant citizens who mistake their conditioning for character. Watch a toddler for 5 minutes and you'll see authentic power. They demand what they want, they express what they feel, they exist without apology. They are inconvenient, unpredictable, and magnificently alive. Then watch that same child 6 months later, after they've been socialized. See how they've learned to smile when they're angry, to say please when they're demanding, to ask permission for things that should be their birthright. This transformation isn't natural development, it's systematic domestication. The wild child who threw tantrums when their needs weren't met has been replaced by a diplomatic little person who has learned that their survival depends on being good, which means being convenient for the adults around them. But here's what Foucault understood that most parents don't. Power doesn't just suppress, it produces. It doesn't just tell you what you can't do, it tells you who you should become. Your family didn't just punish your authentic expressions. They rewarded your compliance so consistently that you began to believe compliance was your natural state. Every time you received praise for being such a good kid, when you suppressed your needs, you internalized the message that your worth was tied to your willingness to disappear. Every time you were told you were being difficult when you expressed authentic emotions, you learned that your feelings were problems to be managed rather than information to be honored. This is where your relationship with authority was forged. In those early moments when you learned that your authentic self was too much, too loud, too inconvenient for the people whose love you desperately needed. You learned that survival meant becoming smaller, quieter, more agreeable. You learned that love was conditional on your willingness to betray yourself. The family structure isn't designed to produce free thinkers. It's designed to produce functional citizens. People who will show up on time, follow rules without question, and never ask too deeply about why things are the way they are. The family is society's first and most effective tool for manufacturing consent. Consider how this played out in your own childhood. You learned to anticipate your parents' moods before they even entered the room. You developed elaborate strategies for avoiding conflict, even when conflict was exactly what the situation required. You became an expert at reading between the lines, interpreting sighs and silences, managing emotional climates that should never have been your responsibility. Your parents didn't need to be cruel to accomplish this. They simply needed to be human, carrying their own unresolved conditioning, their own unexamined fears, their own desperate need to produce a child who wouldn't embarrass them or challenge the systems they themselves were afraid to question. The most tragic part is that they probably thought they were teaching you important life skills. Learn to get along, they said. Don't make waves. Be reasonable. What they were actually teaching you was how to abandon yourself so completely that you wouldn't even notice it was happening. And you, brilliant little survival machine that you were, learned to read the room before you could read books. You learned to prioritize other people's comfort over your own authenticity. You learned that being loved meant being convenient. Carl Jung warned us about this. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But he also understood why most people never even attempt it. Accepting yourself completely means confronting the fact that almost everything you call personality is actually programming. Look at your adult relationships. Notice how you still perform the same dance you learned in childhood, reading moods, managing emotions that aren't yours, sacrificing your authentic desires to keep peace. You call this being considerate or mature, but Jung would recognize it immediately as what he called the persona, the mask you wear to avoid the terror of being truly seen. You've spent decades perfecting this performance. You've become so skilled at anticipating what others want from you that you've forgotten what you actually want for yourself. You mistake hypervigilance for empathy, people-pleasing for kindness, and self-abandonment for love. Here's what's particularly cruel about this system. It made you complicit in your own domestication. You weren't just trained to obey, you were trained to police yourself, to feel guilty when you have needs, ashamed when you have boundaries, selfish when you prioritize your own well-being. Think about your romantic relationships. How often do you find yourself shape-shifting to become what you think your partner wants? How quickly do you abandon your own preferences when they conflict with someone else's? How automatically do you assume responsibility for other people's emotional states? This isn't love. It's codependency dressed up as virtue. You've learned to mistake emotional fusion for intimacy, self-sacrifice for devotion, and the loss of self for the height of romantic connection. You give and give until you're empty, then wonder why you feel resentful and unseen. In your friendships, you've become the eternal diplomat, the one who smooths over conflicts, who remembers everyone's birthdays, who never asks for what you need, because you're too busy anticipating what everyone else might want. You've made yourself indispensable by becoming invisible. At work, You're the reliable one, the one who says yes to every request, who stays late without being asked, who apologizes for things that aren't your fault. You've confused being accommodating with being valuable, not realizing that your inability to say no has actually made you less respected, not more. Your nervous system is still operating from those early programs. When someone's energy shifts, you immediately scan for what you might have done wrong. When conflict arises, your first instinct is to shapeshift until harmony returns. When someone withdraws their approval, you feel that same primal terror you felt as a child, when love seemed conditional on your compliance. The most sophisticated prison systems don't require guards because the prisoners guard themselves. Your childhood programming created an internal warden who monitors your every thought, ensuring you never stray too far from acceptability. This internal warden speaks in your voice, uses your words, and has convinced you that its tyranny is actually your conscience. You've become so identified with your survival adaptations that the thought of living without them feels like death. But Jung understood. What feels like death is actually birth, the birth of your authentic self. The tragedy of adult life isn't that you're unhappy, it's that you've forgotten what genuine happiness even feels like. You've become so skilled at manufacturing appropriate emotions that you've lost touch with your authentic ones. You smile when you're angry, say you're fine when you're falling apart, and perform enthusiasm when you feel empty inside. You've spent so much energy maintaining your persona that you've never developed a relationship with the person behind the mask. You've become a stranger to yourself, an expert at being who others need you to be, and completely lost touch with who you actually are. Friedrich Nietzsche declared that we must become who we are, but he knew that most people would never dare. Why? Because becoming who you truly are requires destroying who you think you're supposed to be. It requires betraying every early program, disappointing every internal authority, and choosing your authentic self over social acceptance. This isn't about rebellion for rebellion's sake. This is about recognizing that your early programming, however well-intentioned, was designed to create a compliant citizen, not a free human being. It was designed to make you manageable, not magnificent. The path back to your authentic self isn't about finding yourself. You were never lost. You were buried. Buried under layers of conditioning, expectations, and survival adaptations that you learned before you could choose otherwise. The path forward is archaeological, carefully excavating your true nature from beneath decades of accumulated programming. This process begins with a radical recognition. Almost everything you've been taught about maturity, responsibility, and love is actually trauma response disguised as virtue. Your excessive empathy isn't spiritual advancement, it's hypervigilance. Your people-pleasing isn't kindness, it's terror management. Your inability to say no isn't generosity, it's survival programming. The first step toward authentic power is learning to disappoint people, not cruelly, not carelessly, but consistently. Every time you choose your authentic truth over diplomatic accommodation, you take a step away from the frightened child who learned that love was conditional on compliance. This feels terrifying. Because it is terrifying. Your nervous system will interpret every act of authenticity as a threat to your survival. When you stop automatically agreeing, stop managing other people's emotions, stop shrinking yourself to fit into spaces that were never meant for you, every alarm in your system will sound. But here's what no one tells you about authentic power. It's not about controlling others. It's about refusing to be controlled by your own conditioning. It's about recognizing that your people-pleasing, your chronic agreeableness, your desperate need for approval, these aren't personality traits. They're trauma responses masquerading as virtues. Authentic power means learning to tolerate other people's disappointment without immediately moving to fix it. It means allowing others to be uncomfortable with your boundaries instead of sacrificing yourself to restore their comfort. It means choosing your genuine feelings over performed emotions, your actual needs over inherited obligations. This transformation requires grieving. You must mourn the person you thought you were supposed to be, the one who was loved for their compliance rather than their authenticity. You must grieve the fantasy that if you just pleased enough people, accommodated enough needs, sacrificed enough of yourself, you would finally be safe. The ultimate act of rebellion isn't breaking society's rules. It's breaking the internal rules that society programmed into you before you could consent. It's refusing to carry the emotional burdens that were never yours to carry. It's declining to participate in relationships where your authenticity is unwelcome. Most people will never take this journey because it requires accepting that much of what they called love in their early life was actually conditional acceptance based on their willingness to betray themselves. It requires acknowledging that many of their closest relationships are built on performance rather than genuine connection. But for those rare individuals who dare to become who they actually are, beyond the programming, beyond the expectations, beyond the need for approval, life becomes an act of authentic creation rather than sophisticated performance. They discover that real intimacy is only possible when you show up as yourself, not as who you think others need you to be. These individuals learn to trust their own instincts over other people's opinions. They develop the capacity to sit with conflict rather than immediately rushing to restore harmony. They discover that their authentic presence is far more valuable than their accommodating performance. The question isn't whether you were programmed to obey. The question is, now that you know, what are you going to do about it? Your authentic self is still there, waiting beneath all the conditioning. It's the part of you that knows what you really want, feels what you actually feel, and needs what you genuinely need. It's the part of you that existed before you learned to doubt your own perceptions, before you learned to prioritize others' comfort over your own truth. The question is whether you have the courage to disappoint everyone else in order to finally meet yourself, whether you're willing to trade the security of being loved for your performance for the terrifying freedom of being loved for who you actually are. This is the pathless path, not a journey towards something you need to acquire, but a return to something you never actually lost. Your authentic self isn't waiting to be discovered. It's waiting to be remembered, honored, and finally allowed to live.